When humanity first entered galactic space, it did so in vessels that made seasoned alien engineers wince, boxy hulls covered in exposed seams, drive that burned loud and inefficient, sensor masks bolted on like afterthoughts, and communications that lagged just enough to feel embarrassing. And this was not an accident, but a decision signed off by committees, reviewed by historians, and approved by people who had spent their lives studying how civilizations rose and fell, because humans had learned the hard way that appearing strong invited challenges while appearing harmless invited underestimation, and underestimation bought time. So when the first contact envoys from the Kepri Union arrived in Earth orbit, they were greeted not by sleek warships' overwhelming displays, but by a modest escort and diplomats who spoke openly about humanity's recent struggles, resource constraints, and desire to learn. And the Kepri recorded humanity as a promising but technologically immature species, curious, cooperative, and decades behind the curve, a classification that followed humans into every database thereafter, shaping how the galaxy perceived them, treated them, and most importantly ignored them, and humans leaned into that perception with quiet discipline, exporting low-end manufactured goods instead of advanced systems, licensing outdated propulsion designs, and accepting trade roles that kept them economically useful but strategically irrelevant, while behind closed doors Earth's research habitats pushed physics boundaries that most species had declared impractical or taboo, because humans had no such taboos left after surviving themselves, and when questioned about their slow progress, human ambassadors smiled and spoke about cultural priorities, environmental recovery, and internal development, phrases that translated across species as excuses. And so humanity was allowed to expand quietly, settling marginal systems no one else wanted places with, unstable stars or strange spatial anomalies that alien navigators avoided. But human scientists found those anomalies useful, perfect places to hide experimental infrastructure and test theories that required isolation. And for generations this pattern held. The galaxy grew louder and more crowded while humanity remained on the fringes, polite, helpful, and visibly behind, until conflict began breaking out between larger powers, and humans were asked to provide logistical support, medical aid, and neutral mediation, roles that further reinforced their image as service-oriented and non-threatening. And every time a human ship arrived late or malfunctioned in public, it reinforced a myth, even as internal reports noted that those same ships performed flawlessly when unobserved. And the first cracks appeared when a minor power attempted to annex a human-administered world, assuming it would be an easy political win. And humanity responded not with fleets but with paperwork, contesting the claim through every legal mechanism available, dragging the process out for years, during which time the annexing power's economy began to falter due to subtle disruptions in trade routes and data networks that no one could trace back to Earth. And when the claim was finally withdrawn, humanity thanked the Council for its wisdom, and the galaxy moved on, never asking how a supposedly primitive species had orchestrated outcomes that reshaped markets across multiple sectors. And it was only when a young analyst from the VLI's Combined noticed that every major technological leap in the last century seemed to follow patterns first published in obscure human academic journals that questions began to surface, because those journals had been dismissed as theoretical exercises from a species that could barely maintain a jump gate, and when those questions reached senior leadership they were waved away, because admitting that humans had deliberately hidden their capabilities meant admitting that the galaxy's entire assessment framework was flawed, and no civilization likes to confront that, especially not ones built on hierarchy and certainty. And so the illusion held right up until the day a Coord research station suffered a containment failure that threatened to collapse a local star, and while the dominant powers debated evacuation protocols and liability clauses, a human ship arrived unannounced, its outdated hull broadcasting the same inefficient signature everyone recognized, and docked with the station using manual controls that impressed no one. And then, quietly, without spectacle or announcement, the containment stabilized, the star settled, and the crisis ended. And when asked how they had done it, the human crew shrugged and said it was an old trick, something that had worked out back home centuries ago. And for the first time the galaxy hesitated, because primitive species did not solve problems that advanced civilizations could not. And as data requests flooded in and humans politely declined, citing proprietary safety concerns, the realization began to spread that humanity's backward appearance had not been a sign of limitation but of intent, a mask worn patiently while the galaxy looked elsewhere, and that the question was no longer whether humans were primitive, but why a species capable of such restraint would choose to let the universe believe it. The internal debate that followed the incident at the research station never reached public channels, but within closed council chambers and secure data nexuses a quiet unease took root. Because every serious civilization keeps contingents and models for threats it understands, and humanity no longer fit any existing category. They were not aggressive conquerors, not passive dependents, not reckless innovators, but something far more difficult to plan against, a species that deliberately chose when to be seen and when to disappear. And as inquiries increase, human responses remain consistent, courteous, and unhelpfully vague, offering cooperation without transparency, assistance without disclosure, and reassurances without concessions. And this frustrated analysts who were accustomed to extracting leverage from younger species, because there was nothing to push against, no overt violation, no hostile posture, only a growing trail of solved problems and stabilized crises that pointed back to Earth without ever confirming intent. And meanwhile, humanity continued to play its part convincingly. Public fleets still flew ships that looked a generation behind. Trade catalogs still listed conservative technologies. And ambassadors still spoke of catching up. Yet behind that facade, coordination tightened across human space, not in the form of mobilization but alignment. Standards unified, data harmonized, protocols synchronized, all quietly justified as efficiency improvements for humanitarian response. And when an internal memo from the Kepri Union suggested reclassifying humanity from developing to emerging, it stalled for years in committee because no one could agree on what that actually meant. And uncertainty in bureaucratic systems is a powerful break, something humans understood intimately. And then came the border incident with the Oryx Dominion, a rigid, honor-bound power that interpreted humanity's non-threatening posture as a deliberate insult, because to the Oryx strength was respect and restraint was deception. And when an Oryx patrol sees a human survey vessel operating legally within neutral space, it was framed as a test, a challenge meant to force humanity to either submit publicly or escalate and reveal itself. And the galaxy watched closely, expecting the familiar pattern of protest notes and withdrawal. But instead, humanity did something subtly different. They complied with Oryx legal processes, sent lawyers instead of warships, accepted the seizures pending arbitration, and while the Oryx preened at what they thought was submission, their legal systems became clogged with human filings, appeals, counterclaims, and procedural demands that were all technically valid and impeccably documented, stretching a process designed for swift judgment into an endless loop. And during that time, human trade with Oryx-aligned partners shifted, insurance rates changed, shipping schedules adjusted, none of it punitive enough to be labeled sanctions, but together creating economic drag that the Dominion could not explain. And when Oryx leaders demanded to know what humanity wanted, the answer was always the same: the safe return of the crew and adherence to established law. And when the crew was eventually released without ceremony, the galaxy noted that humanity had once again avoided conflict. But what they did not see was the internal Oryx assessment that quietly downgraded humanity from harmless to destabilizing. Because a primitive species should not have been able to inflict that level of systemic strain without firing a shot, and whispers began circulating among military planners that if humans ever chose to stop pretending the balance of power would shift unpredictably, and that fear prompted surveillance, covert probes, and intelligence-gathering operations aimed at uncovering humanity's true capabilities. Operations that all failed without explanation, because human systems did not repel intrusions aggressively. They absorbed them, studied them, and returned nothing but noise, feeding adversaries exactly the level of confirmation bias they expected. And the deeper those agencies looked, the more fragmented the picture became, with some reports painting humans as master strategists and others dismissing those conclusions as paranoia. And Earth did nothing to clarify, continuing its slow expansion into overlooked regions, building habitats in places no one contested, and cultivating relationships with minor species who appreciated protection without dominance. And those relationships mattered when another crisis erupted, this time a coordinated attempt by several mid-tier powers to impose regulatory control over human research exports, a move framed as safety oversight but understood by humans as an attempt to box them in. And humanity responded by opening its books selectively, sharing decades-old data that impressed no one while withholding anything current, under the guise of national security. And the proposal collapsed under its own weight, because regulating a species that claimed to be behind required standards that no one could agree on. And as the galaxy argued, humanity kept working, refining the art of being underestimated into a strategic doctrine taught at their academies, not as deception but as restraint. A belief that survival favored those who delayed revealing their full hand until it truly mattered, and by the time the wider galaxy began to seriously consider that humans might be far more advanced than they appeared, it was already too late to reset the narrative, because power is not just ships and weapons but expectations, and humanity had shaped those expectations so thoroughly that even clear evidence was discounted, leaving them exactly where they wanted to be, quietly prepared, broadly connected, and universally misjudged, waiting not for conquest or revenge, but for the moment when pretending to be primitive would no longer be the safest choice. The moment when pretending to be primitive stopped being the safest choice did not arrive with alarms or declarations, but with a statistical anomaly flagged deep inside a human risk assessment model, a projected convergence of unrelated conflicts that would intersect along trade routes humanity relied on to quietly support dozens of minor worlds, and unlike the larger powers, those worlds had no fleets to spare, no political weight to throw around, and no appetite for war, and humanity had spent generations cultivating trust there precisely because trust did not show up on threat charts. So when simulations showed cascading collapse if those roots were disrupted, human leadership did not debate whether to intervene but how to do so without shattering the mask they had worn for so long. And that debate revealed a core truth that outsiders never grasped, that the appearance of primitiveness was not cowardice or trickery but a cultural scar, a lesson burned into humanity by its own history. That power displayed too early invited endless cycles of escalation, and yet scars do not stop bleeding when pressure is applied, and pressure was now building as rival empires mobilized near the corridors humans depended on, each assuming the others would blink first. And in that assumption lay the danger, because none of them accounted for the quiet species in the margins whose logistics stitched the region together. And so humanity acted in layers, first by rerouting aid through alternate channels, then by issuing navigational advisories that framed the corridors as unstable due to natural phenomena, advisories that insurance guilds treated seriously because human data had an uncanny track record for accuracy, and when fleets ignored those advisories and pushed through anyway, the incidents began, not attacks but failures, jump misalignments, power fluctuations, sense of blindness, events that forced ships to retreat or risk annihilation by physics rather than enemies. And commanders complained loudly while analysts quietly noticed that the failures never affected human vessels. And still the galaxy hesitated to call it intent because the old image of human backwardness clashed with the idea of such precise environmental control. And it was during this uneasy pause that a coalition task force attempted to seize a relay hub jointly administered by humans and a minor species, calculating that the humans would withdraw to avoid confrontation and the locals would fold. And for the first time in recorded history, a human patrol did not withdraw. It arrived early, took position, and issued a warning that was brief, clear, and entirely devoid of diplomatic cushioning, stating that the hub was under human protection and that any attempt to interfere would be stopped, language so uncharacteristic that it triggered confusion rather than fear. And the task force advanced anyway, confident that the humans were bluffing with outdated ships and minimal numbers. And when firing solutions locked on human vessels, there was a pause, a heartbeat where the galaxy waited for humans to either flee or be destroyed, and instead the space around the hub changed, not visibly, not violently, but decisively, as if the rules had been rewritten locally, because weapon systems lost coherence, guidance failed, and the attacking ships found themselves unable to align their vectors, drifting helplessly while human ships moved freely among them, placing themselves between weapons and the hub with an ease that suggested complete mastery of the environment. And still no shots were fired, no explosions lit the void, only immobilization and containment. And when the task force commanders demanded an explanation, the human response was almost apologetic, stating that the region was now operating under restricted physical parameters for safety reasons, parameters humans had studied for centuries in the unstable systems they were thought foolish to inhabit. And the message finally landed, not as terror but as cold realization, that humanity had not been lagging behind galactic technology but had been developing along an entirely different axis, one focused less on destruction and more on control. And the Council convened an emergency session as footage circulated of advanced fleets rendered irrelevant by a handful of human ships that still looked primitive on the outside, and representatives argued over whether this constituted an act of war while smaller species watched in, or because for the first time someone had stood between them and annihilation without demanding fealty, and humanity's ambassador addressed the chamber not with triumph but with weariness, explaining that this was why humans had hidden, because once such capabilities were revealed they could not be unseen, and expectations would shift, alliances would harden, and fear would replace ignorance, but that allowing harm to those under their protection was no longer acceptable, and that humanity would continue to limit its visibility where possible, but would no longer pretend to be incapable when lives were at stake. And in that moment, the galaxy understood the true cause of underestimation. Not that it led to sudden defeat, but that it blinded entire civilizations to the fact that power could exist without domination, waiting patiently, choosing silence until silence itself became a liability. And as fleets withdrew and the hub remained intact, the old classification of humanity as primitive quietly disappeared from databases, replaced by blank fields and unresolved tags, because no existing metric could adequately describe a species that had mastered the art of appearing small while carrying the way to an entirely different future. The removal of humanity's classification did more damage to the galactic order than any fleet engagement ever could, because hierarchies rely on labels to function, and without one, humanity became an undefined variable in every strategic equation, prompting reactions that range from cautious outreach to paranoid containment planning. And while the major powers argued over whether humans should be elevated, restricted, or isolated, humanity itself did not campaign for status or recognition. Instead, it doubled down on what it had always done best, stabilizing quietly, reinforcing networks of trust with minor species, and refining the systems it had just revealed enough to make them credible but not enough to make them replicable. And this frustrated military theorists who wanted schematics and diplomats who wanted treaties, because humans offered neither, only assurances that their actions were defensive and conditional, statements that were technically true but strategically unsatisfying. And beneath that diplomatic surface, human society was undergoing its own reckoning, because the choice to reveal even a fraction of their true capability had cracked a long-standing consensus that invisibility equaled safety, and younger generations who had grown up believing the galaxy would never truly see them now watch feeds of immobilized armadas and realize that the lie was thinning. And debates raged in assemblies and forums about whether humanity could ever go back to being underestimated, with historians warning that once a threshold is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed, and those warnings proved accurate when a coalition of nervous powers attempted to form a technological oversight bloc aimed explicitly at human research, a move framed as cooperative governance but understood universally as fear-driven control. And humanity responded not with refusal but with transparency of a particular kind, opening archives of failed experiments, abandoned theories, and ethical dead ends that spanned centuries, overwhelming oversight committees with so much context and cautionary detail that no clear regulatory path emerged, because humans had already explored and rejected avenues others were only beginning to consider, and the effort stalled, leaving humanity uncontained and increasingly respected by smaller species who saw in them a protector that did not demand obedience, and that respect translated into alignment, shared standards, mutual defense clauses, framed as disaster response agreements, and trade networks that quietly bypass traditional power centers, creating a parallel infrastructure that functioned without challenging the old order directly, and the old order noticed only when disruptions began appearing in places they had once controlled absolutely, worlds choosing human mediation over imperial arbitration, corporations adopting human safety models that undercut profit-driven expansion, and cultural exchanges that shifted public perception away from fear and toward curiosity. And this slow drift alarmed hardliners who argued that humanity's strategy of appearing primitive had always been a prelude to dominance, proof that deception was inherent to their nature, and those voices gained traction when an incident occurred that could not be softened or obscured. A human experimental habitat in a marginal system was deliberately attacked by a covert strike force aiming to provoke a visible response, and this time humanity did not withdraw, did not litigate, did not absorb the blow quietly, because the habitat housed not just researchers but families, children who had never known Earth and had been raised on the promise that hiding was what kept them safe, and the loss of life cut through centuries of restraint, and humanity's response was immediate and unmistakable. Not a barrage of fire, but a declaration that the attackers would be removed from all accessible space until restitution was made, a statement many dismissed as rhetorical until the attacking power's military asset began dropping out of navigable space entirely, fleets frozen in inert pockets, command structures isolated, economies paralyzed not by destruction but by absence, and the galaxy watched in stunned disbelief as an empire was effectively paused, not conquered, not annihilated, simply made incapable of projecting force. And humanity addressed the council once more, stating calmly that this was why they had pretended to be primitive, because the alternative was not war but erasure of threat, a tool too final to be used lightly, and that they would reverse the containment once accountability was met. And for the first time, the dominant powers understood that humanity's restraint had been an act of mercy, not caution, a choice to live among the stars without imposing their will. And that by forcing humanity's hand, they had revealed a future where power was no longer measured by who could destroy the most, but by who could decide when destruction was no longer necessary at all. The aftermath of the paused empire sent shockwaves through every level of galactic society, because nothing in recorded history prepared civilization for a response that removed the ability to act without inflicting visible damage, and fear spread not through images of burning worlds but through empty charts and silent channels. As analysts realized that deterrence based on retaliation meant nothing to a species that could simply make aggression impossible, and in that fear alliances fractured. Because no one wanted to be bound to a partner who might provoke humanity's quiet finality, and at the same time smaller species accelerated their alignment with Earth, formalizing agreements that emphasized mutual aid, transparency, and non-aggression, terms that sounded harmless until it became clear they also embedded human standards of infrastructure and governance that subtly reshaped entire regions. And humanity did not rush this process. It let it unfold at the pace of trust, sending educators instead of soldiers, engineers instead of overseers, and observers instead of enforcers, reinforcing the narrative that it was not seeking control, only stability, and that narrative was difficult to argue against because wherever humans became involved, conflict levels dropped and prosperity rose, and still the larger powers searched desperately for a way to reassert relevance, commissioning studies, reverse engineering fragments of human tech, and even attempting to replicate the environmental control effects witnessed at the relay hub, all of which failed because they misunderstood the foundation, assuming it was a matter of hardware rather than philosophy, because human systems were built on an acceptance of complexity and uncertainty that other species found uncomfortable, a willingness to design for worst-case outcomes rather than optimal performance, and this difference became stark when a new crisis emerged, a naturally occurring spatial instability spreading across several sectors that threatened to sever major trade routes permanently, and for the first time the dominant powers openly asked humanity for help, not as a junior partner or quiet fixer, but as a leader, and humanity hesitated, not out of spite, but because stepping fully into that role meant abandoning the last remnants of the mask they had worn for centuries, and internal debates flared once more. Elders reminding the young of the dangers of being seen, and the young countering that. Hiding had already cost lives, and in the end the decision was made collectively, because that was how humans did things when stakes were existential, and when humanity intervened it did so openly, deploying structures and techniques that rewrote local space to stabilize the instability, feats that dwarfed previous demonstrations and left no doubt that humans were operating on a level the galaxy had never accounted for. And yet the tone remained measured, explanatory, almost instructional, as if they wanted others to understand not just what was being done but why. And this transparency shifted something fundamental, because fear rooted in ignorance gave way to fear tempered by comprehension, and comprehension opened the door to adaptation. And in councils and academies across the galaxy, new doctrines began to form that treated humanity not as an anomaly to be contained but as a precedent to be learned from. And that was perhaps the most unsettling change of all, because it meant the old order was not just threatened but obsolete. And humanity watched this transformation with a mix of pride and sorrow, knowing that the galaxy they had entered as a supposed primitive no longer existed, replaced by something more complex and less certain, and that from this point forward pretending to be small was no longer an option, only choosing carefully how big they were willing to be. By the time the sixth cycle after the stabilization crisis came to a close, it was clear that the galaxy was reorganizing itself around an absence rather than a presence, the absence of the old assumptions that had once governed power. Because even where humans were not physically present, their influence shaped decisions, and that influence was subtle enough to be deniable but strong enough to be decisive, a combination that unsettled species accustomed to clear lines of dominance, and as new institutions formed that mirrored human cooperative frameworks, the older empires faced a choice between adaptation and decline, a choice many delayed making because delay had always been safer than change, and humanity watched those delays with the same patience it had once used to cultivate its primitive image, understanding that transformation forced too quickly only bred resistance. And so humans limited their direct interventions to moments of genuine crisis, allowing the galaxy to stumble forward on its own where possible, even as human academies began quietly accepting off-world students, not to teach weapons or control, but systems thinking, resilience planning, and the uncomfortable practice of designing for failure, concept that challenged deeply ingrained cultural norms among alien attendees who were used to projecting certainty and perfection. And those students returned home carrying ideas that spread faster than technology ever could, because ideas reshape priorities, budgets, and expectations, and that intellectual diffusion worried hardliners far more than any human fleet, leading to renewed covert efforts to undermine humanity's credibility, efforts that range from propaganda campaigns painting humans as manipulative architects of chaos to staged incidents designed to provoke an overreaction, and humanity responded to these provocations the same way it always had, by documenting everything, sharing evidence calmly, and refusing to escalate, a restraint that frustrated their critics because it denied them a narrative of human aggression they desperately wanted, and yet beneath that restraint a line had been drawn, unspoken but universally understood, that deliberate harm to civilians or protected populations would not be tolerated, and when a rogue faction tested that boundary by targeting a mixed species habitat aligned with human standards, of response was swift and absolute, not public, not dramatic, but effective as the factions. Leadership found itself isolated from all communication, trade, and movement within days, their influence collapsing as allies distanced themselves to avoid secondary containment, and the message spread without a single official statement, reinforcing the understanding that humanity's power lay not in spectacle but in inevitability, and this inevitability began to alter how conflicts were planned, with war becoming less attractive not because it was unwinnable but because it was increasingly pointless in a system where escalation only narrowed options, and historians would later mark this period as a beginning of the quiet realignment, a phase where open conquest faded not due to moral awakening but pragmatic exhaustion, and throughout it humanity remained an anchor rather than a ruler, refusing formal leadership roles while informally setting standards through consistent behavior. And in private, many human leaders wondered whether the galaxy would ever fully trust them now that the mask was gone, or whether fear would always linger beneath cooperation. But those doubts were tempered by moments that felt quietly hopeful, like when a former imperial strategist addressed a human forum and admitted that pretending to be primitive had not been deception but restraint, a gift of time the galaxy had nearly wasted. And as that admission circulated, it reframed humanity's long silence not as manipulation, but as an invitation, one that many had ignored until circumstances forced them to listen. And by then the universe had already begun to change in ways that could not be reversed, because the idea that power could choose not to dominate had taken root, and once planted it proved harder to uproot than any empire built on fear alone. The final shift came not with a crisis, but with a choice, one made collectively across human space and quietly communicated to the rest of the galaxy that the era of intentional obscurity was over, not because humanity sought recognition or authority, but because continuing to hide would now cause more harm than good, and that admission was delivered without ceremony, folded into routine diplomatic briefings and technical exchanges, almost easy to miss unless one understood its weight, because humans did not announce themselves as guardians or leaders. They simply stated that they would no longer misrepresent their capabilities, that future interactions would be based on accurate assessments rather than cultivated misconceptions, and this honesty unsettled many who had grown accustomed to projecting their fears and fantasies onto a supposedly primitive species, forcing them to confront the reality that they had built entire strategies on a lie humanity had allowed for the sake of peace. And as revised data flowed through galactic systems, it became clear just how long humans had been operating ahead of the curve, not in a single domain but across many: logistics, resilience engineering, social cohesion, crisis response, and environmental control, all areas historically undervalued by civilizations obsessed with firepower, and the revelation did not spark panic or war, because the galaxy was too tired for that, too aware now of the cost of miscalculation, and instead it sparked something quieter, a recalibration of ambition, as powers scaled back expansionist doctrines in favor of sustainability models inspired by human practice, and worlds once caught between empires found themselves with options they had never had before, and humanity supported that shift without directing it, offering frameworks rather than mandates, examples rather than enforcement. And in doing so, it finally shed a last shadow of the primitive myth, replacing it with a reputation that was harder to simplify and therefore harder to exploit. And years later, when historians attempted to summarize the turning point, they struggled to pin it to a single event, because the truth was that humanity's greatest act had not been revealing its power but choosing when and how to stop hiding it, and in that choice the galaxy learned a lesson it would carry forward into every future encounter. That the most dangerous mistake was not underestimating an enemy, but misunderstanding a neighbor, who had gone out of its way, for generations, to give everyone else time to grow up, and that once that time was spent, the universe would never again look at quiet, patient species the same way, because somewhere among them might be another humanity, waiting, watching, and deciding whether it was still worth pretending to be small.